Living a life in full is a conversation you always wanted to have with that person who gave an amazing TED Talk, or the author of one of your favorite books, or that inspirational Olympian you always wanted to know more about. It's graduate-level conversations with those making a difference in the world and in the lives of others. This show brings you new ideas and approaches so that you can live a life in full. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Stout, and I hope you enjoy this episode. This episode is brought to you by the nonprofit I founded, the Center for Global Initiatives. The Center is an all-volunteer organization, so there are no salaries, and thus all tax-deductible donations can go to the work. While our key country partner is in Tanzania, our work is global and generally focused in the areas of education and healthcare. We also help others to get their nonprofits started or augment others' project-based initiatives. It's our goal to open-source humanitarian intervention and to help make it easier for others to do more good in the world. We are proud to have been ranked a great nonprofit every year since 2011 and to have achieved a platinum-level rating by GuideStar. Links in this episode's show notes will take you to published articles on our outcomes, a number of helpful tools, and downloadable resources, which are all free, always. Please visit us at centerforglobalinitiatives.org and be sure to watch our video at patreon.com/Dr. Chris Stout to learn more. Thanks. Welcome to another episode of Living a Life in Full. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Stout. We spend our lives trying to anchor our transience in some illusion of permanence and stability. We lay plans, make vows, we backbone the flow of uncertainty with habits and routines that lull us in the comforting dream of predictability and control, only to find ourselves again and again bent at the knees with surrender to forces and events vastly larger than us. In those moments, kneeling in the pool of the unknown, the heart breaks open and allows life itself, not the simulacrum of life that comes from control, to rush in. Those are the words of Maria Popova on how to live with that generative brokenness, and is what composer Tina Davidson explores in her memoir, Let Your Heart Be Broken, Life and Music from a Classical Composer, which Maria describes as a lyrical reckoning with what it takes to compose a life of cohesion and beauty out of shattered bits and broken stories. Tina Davidson was 3.5 years old when she was adopted from her foster home in Sweden by a visiting American professor. Soon after that, she was the eldest of 5 children, living with her mother and stepfather in Turkey, Germany, and Israel. She studied music and became a prolific pianist and composer, but something about her birth remained unnamed and hidden. When she returned to Sweden, she contacted the Swedish adoption agency, and a voice on the phone said, "Come, I have information for you." In Let Your Heart Be Broken, Tina juxtaposes memories, journal entries, and insight into the life of an artist and a mother at work. Along the way, she meets Ernest Hemingway and Carl Sandburg, survives an attack by nomads in Turkey, and learns her birth father is a world-famous scientist. And throughout, there is a thread of music, an ebb and a crescendo of a journey out of the past and into the present, through darkness and into the light. Tina is a writer and a classical composer now for 45 years, whose works have been performed by ensembles and orchestras across the country, including the Philadelphia Orchestra, American Composers Orchestra, Kronos Quartet, St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, Cassatt Quartet, as well as recordings with Albany Music and on Deutsche Grammophon, performed by Grammy-winning violinist Hilary Hahn, all while being a single parent. Her life is filled with experiences that are as amazing as they are touching, heart-wrenching as they are instructive, as she shares her dealing with depression and dissociation and her work to reclaim herself through therapy and spiritual practice. Tina, it's great to have you on.
Wow, thank you so much for having me.
You know, we started before we hit record. I wanted to discuss your background in your life as well as the book. But as we said, you know, as it's a memoir, they really aren't separate discussions. So I'm thinking we might just kind of do a combo and see if we can do that, if that sounds good.
That sounds great.
Awesome. Before we dive in, I want to share maybe what some others have said about your book. Tim Page, Pulitzer Prize-winning music writer, said Tina Davidson writes with precision and poetry. Maria Popova said, "Let Your Heart Be Broken is a consummate read in its entirety, exploring with uncommon sensitivity and poetic insight the fundamentals of love, forgiveness, creativity, and what it takes to emerge from the inner darkness into a vast vista of light, rooted in life-tested truth that we are, in the end, a measure of the love we leave behind." John Sobel of Blog Critics said, "With this memoir, Tina Davidson accomplishes something much more difficult because it goes deeper into the soul, conveying what goes on inside when an artist, one particular artist, is creating the work that both reveals herself and escapes to become the world's, taking on a different meaning for every listener." And Hilary Hahn, Grammy-winning violinist, said, "Rarely does a composer tie together life events and inner creative propulsion in a narrative that speaks directly to their audience. Ms. Davidson's music is lyrical and vulnerable, as is her voice in words." And Tina, I have to agree, it's a wonderful work. And maybe to start off, do you feel like there's a paradox in that typically the artist's dilemma is to be heard and not found, but in writing a memoir versus a composition of music, isn't that the cause? Doesn't that cause you to be found as well?
Oh, yes. That quote from Mumford, "The artist's dilemma is to be heard but not found," was definitely where I was when I started writing music. And it was certainly the attractiveness of composing, because I could tell my story. And because I really didn't know it at that point, I hadn't really found out some of the truths about my birth story. It was a way of me writing in anonymity. And that was amazing. However, when I started to uncover about myself, I realized that I could only move forward as a composer and as a person if I was going to be more visible in expressing what was going on for me. That my initial attraction to that quote was where I was when I started my career in my 20s. And by the time I got to be 30, it became an impediment because I couldn't actually be authentic. Because I was keeping it from myself as well as from the audiences.
Wow. Yeah, and I feel like we'll probably go back and forth between writing, life experience, composition, and music. I also have to say I'm a big fan after reading your book. I will nerd out periodically here on some excerpts and things. But you begin the book with your author's note, and you recount a talk that you attended by Stephen Levine, who, for folks that don't know, is a poet and author, and perhaps best known for his work on death and dying. And he answered someone that was in the audience in a Q&A. They questioned him, like the proverbial, what's the meaning of life? And you wrote in your book that he responded, "I think the meaning of life is to let your heart be broken." And then you went on to write, "Let your heart be broken. Allow, expect, look forward to. The life that you have so carefully protected and cared for. Broken, cracked, rent in two. Heartbreakingly, your heart breaks. And in the two halves, rocking on the table, is revealed rich earth, moist, dark soil, ready for new life to begin." That's just beautiful. I felt like I was reading poetry almost more so than a memoir, quite through it, Tina. So in the book, and maybe this is like one of the outside questions, I didn't really get a feel for like your ability with crafting words as well as notes. Where did that come from? Your ability to be an author of written material, not just music.
Well, my mother and stepfather were literature professors, so there was an awful lot of literature around the household, and I read a huge amount. But also, as part of my composing practice, I would journal, and I would journal maybe an hour a day. I first had to read I always had to read because I felt like I needed to nurture my brain and my understanding of life. And it's sort of like reading in terms of composing was like sitting down and eating a really good meal that had nutrition in it and
Yeah.
really fortified me. And then the writing, and I had a composing journal, I had a personal journal, and then I actually had a spiritual journal at one point. And it was very dedicated to exploring what was going on for me. I know some artists feel that they don't really write about themselves, they write about the universal experience. I happen to be a composer that really finds my self explorations the root of my understanding of the world. So I see through the lens of my eyes. So it's very important to me to understand that. At one point, one of my therapists said, "Oh, you're just so intellectual. I want you to start drawing." So I got out, my colored pencils, and so now part of journaling for me is drawing, and that has become a wonderful self-expression, because there is the way that my heart feels when I write music. When I write about my music, it's more of a brain to page thing. And then when you draw, it's like your hand is just going on its own. It has this sort of wonderful external quality to it. And drawing has been also very, very helpful in the composing process. So I've always written. I always thought in the beginning of choosing a career that I might be a poet. I always loved writing poetry. And one of my sisters, Eva Davidson, is a wonderful poet. The other one, Lolly Davidson, is a wonderful writer and has published 3 books, or is in the process of publishing her 3rd book. So I think it is part of our sort of family heritage, but it's also this decades of writing and being interested in how you turn a phrase. In my book, there are these alternate chapters. So there's one chapter that is a story about my life at a certain time period. And then the next chapter is in my 30s, my journal, my music and composing journal, and my personal journal. And it is not only looking at what I'm doing right then, but also many times looking back at some of the information that I'm learning about my childhood. So you get this sort of double perspective of what is going on, the past and the present that is reflecting on the past, and also thinking about the future. So my publisher said to me, "I love the journal. It's very rare to have a book that includes journal. How much of your journal did you use?" And I said, maybe 5%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I wrote copious. And many times I would write about something that I was thinking about over several days or even weeks. And in the book, I put those together because it would be ridiculous to read about them in that sort of scattered fashion.
Sure. I felt like we'll also periodically bounce around about construction of the book, because there's some really clever things that I thought you did. But since we're talking about the journaling and things, it really were those sort of things that you leaned into in terms of like reflecting back of where you were at those moments in time. And for folks that haven't seen your book yet, there's sort of like excerpts of, like the dates, and then I presume pretty close to a verbatim, rendering of what you had written back then, and then gets contextualized with kind of other life events. So did you think back and then kind of compare it to what the journal said, or did you go through your journals and that triggered memories to then write more fully about those experiences, or was it all the above kind of thing?
So when I was starting to write this book, you're asking, yes. Well, it's interesting. I started to write the book 10 years ago. I was at the end of a second marriage, and leaving that marriage and basically being homeless for 3 or 4 years.
Wow.
Until I found a house to buy and settled. And that was partly by design because I really wanted to make sure that I knew where I was going to live. I decided I would just take it slow.
Mm-hmm.
So I rented and did whatever I needed to. But I think there is no question that the timing of my starting to write this book is a time when you start to reflect on your past life.
Mm-hmm.
And I had really wanted to do two things. I wanted to pull my past life together for myself and some of the traumas, but I also wanted to really try to articulate my composing process.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did go back and read my journals and, have little stickies here and there. And I was amazed at some of them. I mean, for years, I would write down my dreams and then I would analyze them. And honestly, for a reader, that would be just like, oh, I don't want to do that. So there were many years of journals that maybe I used 3% of those. But there were enough little snatches, and also that I would be writing more about my music in my composing journal, that I was able to collate those together and sort of create a framework. And it was a discovery for me because I knew that at that time in my adult life, I was looking back and processing and understanding things at a deeper level. I hadn't quite realized the connection that I was also composing music about it.
Wow.
And I knew it, but I didn't know it with that kind of certainty. So I have a cello quartet that's called Dark Child Sings. And it's really about my allowing that dark child in me that had sort of been left in Sweden to have a voice and to speak out. And again, it's not that intellectual. It's sort of like I hold that idea in my head as I'm writing music. I'm not thinking, oh, now he's going to scream, or, it's just that I keep that in my thoughts while I'm composing, and sort of like my hand when it's drawing, there is a connection between those two.
I see. So was it a therapeutic process to do this when you started during that 10-year time from beginning to end?
Of writing the music, of writing my
memoir?
I think so, yes. I think writing the memoir, I think it's, my experience is that it's about claiming my space. I'm actually starting to write a new piece right now called Above Ground. And when I wrote those words, and I started to laugh like you, I said, oh yeah, that's where you are. You're above ground. And it's this declaration and an exploration of it as well. So, I wrote the book for about 2 years pretty solidly, then put it away for about 5, then it came out, then it went back in, and then about 2 years ago, I started working with this publisher, and they had a brilliant, brilliant editor that I worked with that helped me. I was having trouble with the beginning and the end, so a lot of the beginning material was at the end. I just couldn't figure out how to format it. And she just asked great questions. I think people who are really helpful are ones that help you with critical thinking rather than criticism. So critical thinking is like, what am I doing well? What could I do better? They're really about asking good questions.
I would think, too, in the context of a memoir, I've had a lot of authors on the show, and it's typically been, around nonfiction kinds of matters or historical things or what have you. And I would think that there's kind of a difference. I think it would be, personally, I think it would be quite difficult to kind of sort those things out. So I think it's very fortunate that you had an editor to kind of, suss out the critical thinking aspects of it, because I would get lost in terms of, even if I was like making up a novel, which I could never do, there's sort of the arc of the story. But I think when it's, yourself, and there's, flashback, and there's current things, and there's history, and there's, different types of journals and all these things. It would be quite the challenge to, in your head it makes sense, but to a person that's, has no familiarity with your background or your stories, to
Yes.
try and kind of figure those things out. So it was it, the proverbial, like, do you know the story of the white shoe and the rider?
No.
It's, I don't know where it's kind of a joke, cliche-ish kind of thing, but sort of like when a person's sitting there, needing to be creative and, trying to channel your muse and, forcing something that maybe today's just not the day for it, that they look across the room, they're sitting at their desk or their journal or their computer or their typewriter. They look across the room and they see their white shoes, and they notice this little teeny spot. And then they go, "Oh, I got to clean that spot, man. I can't be writing today. I got to go, get that little, fly speck off the side of my white shoe." So, you talk about it being the arc of your project of being, 10 years time. So what were the things, did you get to certain points where you go, "Oh man, I just need a breather and a break from this"? And then, the certain kinds of things started percolating and got you motivated back into it? Or can you maybe share with us what the process of your ebb and flow of involvement and putting away and getting it done? And you've mentioned the editor, which sounds like that was helpful to, get it to the finish line. But what about the process in between?
I think, you have to remember also, since I'm not really an author and I am a composer, I was always, writing this, I meant I had to stop composing for about a year and a half.
Wow.
Then I'd go back and I was writing a lot of music. And then I'd go back and then I hired another editor who was also wonderful, just to read it and see if she felt that I had written enough information. And then I'd go back to composing. Now, this last year and a half, 2 years has been mostly, I've not written a lot of music because it's been really consumed in this other, finishing my book. One of my big concerns, and I know this is not going to quite answer your question, but it will sort of, is there was a lot of information about my family and about things that had happened to me that I didn't want to write about. I really didn't want to throw anybody under the bus.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be very careful about that because, particularly about my mother, she was, people are very complicated. And I've done really stupid and mean things. And I wouldn't want to be measured by those times necessarily.
Yeah.
And I think when you publish something, it has a lot of, it's kind of like the final word. And it's not as if people in your life can say, "Wait a minute, can I
opportunity for
that?"
rebuttal. Yeah, wait a minute.
And so when I was writing this in particular, I sent it several times to my ex-husband, the father of my daughter, because I wanted to make sure that he was okay with the way that I was portraying him. And I had read a wonderful set of memoirs, sort of, I think, or essays about by Anne Truitt, who is a wonderful sculptor. And what I loved about it is that she talked a lot about her work, and then there were like these characters that kind of floated in and out of her studio, so that you knew she had a personal life, and that was important. But she was not really talking about that. She made a distinction between that. So I did spend a lot of time thinking carefully about how I could allow the reader to have enough room to have their own opinions about the characters in my story.
I had done, when I was doing some research on it, the fact that you did take the time to do that. I think, again, it just kind of speaks to who you are as a person, and trying to be fair-handed about it. And that's, it is a good point. And I can imagine that when biographies, autobiographies, and memoirs come out, that the characters, so to speak, in them, the people that were actually part of that person's life, are like, yikes, what chapter am I in? And, is it going to be a highlight reel of, everything that I did
Yes.
wrong? And I think, to me, I mean, obviously I don't know these people or anything other than what I've read, but things seem very, fair-handed about things. And you have a very gentle way, and as well as a very, beautiful way to frame a sentence in a page that I think is, people would not be, at all offended by it. So we've kind of talked around it, and maybe for those of you that are listening that haven't seen the book yet, this is going to be a bit of a spoiler alert, so maybe, fast forward a minute. But you described growing up and thinking you were adopted, but that wasn't really the case. Can you maybe unpack that for us about when you found out that you were adopted and adopted by who?
So I was born in Sweden, in Stockholm, and then I was placed in a foster home. Probably, it's not really clear, but probably when I was about 6 months old. So I was born in December, and I think it was like the beginning of summer or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I was placed with a family. Solveig was my foster mother. Torsten was my foster father. And I was then the youngest of four. I was the only girl, and I had three older brothers, one of whom, the one that was the closest in age to me, was only a couple months older, and we were sort of brought up as twins. Huh. And I lived there very happily until I was 3.5, when this beautiful professor came. She lived in the town in Malmo for about a month, and she adopted me, and we left. And she married when we got to America, and then I was the oldest of 5. And so, I always knew I was adopted. There wasn't a big deal made of it. My mother didn't treat me any differently. Mm-hmm. My stepfather, I think, had a lot of problems with me. I was 5 when he and my mother married, and I think I was always a little bit of an impediment for him. So he definitely warmed up to children when he had, his 4 kids. But mm-hmm. I always felt like I was sort of outside of the family somehow. And this was a very deep, private thought, and mm-hmm. probably not even articulated to me. Mm-hmm. I knew that I couldn't talk about being adopted to my mother. And every once in a while, one of my siblings would say to me, well, I don't have to obey you because you're adopted.
Wow.
Wow. You know how kids,
Yeah.
That's what kids do.
Yeah.
So I was acutely aware of it. And I was acutely aware that when there was a lot of talk about families and about histories and your great-great-grandfather did this, that was not my great-grandfather. Mm-hmm. I pretended. I knew I was pretending it was my great-great-grandfather. Mm-hmm. So when I was in college, I was 21, I was back in Sweden. I was taking care of a daughter of a family friend. And I thought, well, I'll go to the adoption agency. And I always sort of thought I was Swedish. Uh-huh. I had made up this whole romantic idea.
Sure.
That I was saved from an orphanage or, I had no idea.
Right.
Because remember, I left Sweden. I only spoke Swedish.
Wow.
And I came to America. I had to learn English. Uh-huh. And so when I finally called up and they said, oh, come down, she was sitting there with this piece of paper in her hand, and she was reading. She said, oh, I have a letter from your birth mother. And she was asking me all these questions.
Wow. And
then she finally said, your adopted mother is your birth mother.
It sounds like a screenplay. So did you have to have her repeat that a couple of times to make sure that you understood correctly?
I have to say, I started doing intensive therapy, 10 years later, and realized that I do a fabulous dissociation. I can dissociate. I've had to really work hard not to do it. Yeah. But at that point, it was like the world, just vanished, and wow. I couldn't comprehend the information at all.
Sure. Yeah.
And so when I got back to America, which I I was flying out the next day, I waited a week before I could catch my mother alone. And I said, oh, let's walk up to the park. And I told her, and she wept. But the truth is that she was very bound to this secret. This was something that was really now a fundamental part of her life structure.
Wow.
And she was not going to give it up.
Wow.
It had served us very, very well. It was such a smart thing to do, you know, in the 50s, to have an illegitimate child and to have gone to Penn and gotten a PhD and to be a full professor. Was astonishing for a woman of that time period.
Yeah.
And it was a very smart thing to set up. Very, very smart. But, you know, the difference between privacy and secrets is huge.
Yeah.
And my experience is that also those secrets, it's almost like the secret becomes this crazy, demented puppeteer. Or in the book, I call him a Frankenstein, and he's your own personal Frankenstein. And he's wrecking things. He's like bumping into things and breaking things. You know, he's clumsy, he's large, he's not too smart. And, you know, and I think she had really created this whole story around the story. And, you know,
living the mythology.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, she was this heroic woman who adopted a child, not a heartbroken woman who brought her own child back.
Yeah.
You know, I have a lot of compassion with that. I know that I was hugely angry for decades at her because of her refusal to allow me to have a say in my own story. And that when I did have a say, she would fight against it. For instance, when I was marrying the father of my child, I wanted both my mother and my biological father's family to be there. And she said, no, you have to have two weddings. I'm not going to appear as, you know, the fallen woman.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, but on the other hand, she was this brilliant, very articulate, incredible intellectual, loved her students, taught beautifully. She was such a great teacher, really cared and nurtured her student, was passionate about giving us educational experience. We all played instruments. She loved traveling. You know, we were constantly, you know, I was going off I lived in Germany for a year. I lived in Israel a year. I lived 3 years in Turkey. She was passionately interested in seeing the world and experiencing the world. But, you know, you've got this secret, and I think things kind of calcify around a secret. And it has made me, I think emotional honesty is kind of a crux of existence for me. Because the price that we paid as an entire family was very high.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, just, you know, this kind of a circumstance, speaking to the complexity of, you know, of people and of situations, and then amplifying that by virtue of circumstance and other, you know, people in the family. It's not just, you know, one or two people. I mean, it gets, you know, more complicated as more people and players and their own issues that they bring to things. And one of the things, I mean, what you describe, you know, you were very transparent in the book. And one of the things I thought was very clever, you pieced together various parts of your life that correspond to musical pieces. You kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier when we first started talking. Can you maybe unpack that a little bit more and talk about that relationship?
You know, again, my music is really a reflection of knowing myself. And it's the only one I can trust to speak for.
Right. Yeah, it's got truth. Speaking truth to power.
I just, so I'll pick a piece like my string quartet, one of my first string quartet, Cassandra Sings. We named our daughter Cassandra, and I'd always had a love of the myth of Cassandra because she was a priestess and she had the gift of prophecy. But then I think one of the gods wanted to, have sex with her, and she refused because priestesses have a vow of chastity. And so this god got kind of angry at her, and he cursed her prophecy so that she would tell the truth, but no one would believe her. And of course, this was during the Trojan War, and she's like saying, "Hey, Dad," who was the king of Piram, she said, "This is not a good thing," and nobody believed her. And then she was captured by Agamemnon, who was one of the victors, and brought as a slave and as a concubine back to Greece, where he was then murdered. They both were murdered by the queen, Clytemnestra. So, and here's my daughter being named Cassandra. And I was thinking, what is the voice of women, of myself, who speak the truth and aren't heard? How is that throughout history? And so when I read the play, Cassandra is one of the characters other than the chorus that is allowed to sing. She is actually the only character in all of Greek plays that is allowed to sing because the chorus speaks the truth, and so does Cassandra. And I thought, Cassandra's singing, and for us to come into a time where we actually, my daughter's time, hopefully, where women can be heard. So that understanding of myself as a woman, my mother was like a hardcore feminist, and seeing how she struggled by having 5 children and a full-time job and
to travel and
yes, and so then that was what I was holding in my head as I was writing this idea of Cassandra singing. So that again, and that was at a place in my life where I was really looking at myself as a woman, particularly in music. If you think of music, classical music, not as high art, where these composers had somehow tapped into something that was way above our understanding and was expressing that, but they really were composing about their lives. So Beethoven was really composing about his life. He was a white guy, he was a Christian, he was educated, he, hung around with people who had money. He wasn't, so he had some social status, and, kind of grumpy, maybe, single, male. And if you look at the music from that lens, if you said, okay, let's look at it, then the climax of his symphonies, they kind of arrive, and don't you love that word climax?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
So then I think, okay, if I am female and I'm living in this time, what is the climax of my music? What is that like through my experience? So I was thinking a lot about that, and as I was defining myself versus my childhood, I was also defining myself as a woman, as a composer, and wondering, how can I dig into that deep soil, if you will, to write expressiveness.
And if my facts are straight in doing history and background, you really didn't start composing until college, is that right? You were just
That's right.
Start off as a pianist, and was that what spurred that in college? Was it a course or just a desire?
Well, at Bennington College, they had this crazy idea, which is not an academic idea of the time at all. In academia, you do not compose until you've taken years of theory, harmony, orchestration. I mean, you've just had 4 or 5 years of kind of the grammar of music, learning the grammar, learning how to make a perfect sentence, but not writing anything. And they had an alternate view. They had a lot of composers on board, and they said that every performer should be a composer and every composer should be a performer.
Wow.
So I was a very good pianist at that point, and they threw me into Music One for advanced performers, and the job was to write music. And I thought they were crazy. Well, I had never, first of all, the truth is, I had never played any music by a woman composer.
Wow.
It never occurred to me that it was a career profession, that I could. So I was a kind of reluctant, and my first piece, and worse yet, they just handed out staff paper, and they said, here's your, you pick 2 instruments in the class. I picked oboe and French horn. Go out and write, they told you how many bars, write some music.
Here's the deep end, hop in.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was a horrible piece. I got a lot of criticism, and I vowed never to write for oboe and French horn again, which was a good choice.
Okay.
It's not a great combination. And by the end of the semester, I was hooked. And again, it was this wanting to be creative in something, to speak my story, it was sort of, as I looked into the forest, and you could see there were lots of paths into the forest of life, but only one was illuminated. And that's where I was going. And I was very serious about it. Really one track at that point.
How did you go from piano then to being so wonderful with strings? I mean, I probably don't know your whole catalog, but the things that I am familiar with, are very, string quartets and,
Yes.
And I think I certainly, I can hardly listen to anything with a cello in it without tearing up. So I get the emotion of that. But how did you go from piano to string quartets?
I was part of a group in Philadelphia called Relash, and their instrumentation was kind of crazy. They had a saxophone and a double bass and a clarinet and a piano and it was just a crazy kind of combination. But when I got the commission from the Kronos Quartet, that was the first time I'd really seriously written for strings. And the truth is that my mother was a wonderful amateur violinist.
Oh.
She played all the time. My sister was a wonderful violinist. And everybody played a stringed instrument. I was the only one who was a pianist.
Oh.
And I think having that sound in my ear was really informative. And as an aside, I have to say one of the things that I love to hear about is when my siblings, I was 7 years older than the oldest of them and 14 years older than the youngest. And but their memories of their childhood is that it was filled with my playing the piano, that I was always playing the piano. And that's that musical sort of imprint on their memories is really interesting.
That is.
But I've just always loved, I played cello in college. I teach a little bit of cello. I have a blog that says my heart is a cello. And I think one of the interesting things, psychological things about a cello, it's the only instrument that you play where you open your legs and you place the cello between your knees and you lean the top of the cello against your sternum. And I think it's very telling, to be able to embrace an instrument like that. You wrap your arms around it. Now, a double bass, you stand usually,
right?
Or you sit to the side. Violin, you have it resting on your shoulder. But I think that physical contact with the cello has always made me in love with it.
Yeah. Wow. That's really good juxtaposition. And again, just the physicality of that. And like you were saying earlier, just even the vocabulary of, compositions and how, music gets described. So you also write about, and I'd like you to speak to the impact of the childhood trauma in composition of music, and maybe elaborate on. I'm guessing that informs the whole Cassandra kind of thing, and having voice to it. But is there also like the emotional aspect, not just the like? Is it an issue of being believed as well as being heard, or maybe unpack that a little bit more for us?
Well, I will answer it this way. I'm not exactly sure if it's what you're looking for, but of the 45 years that I've been writing music, I would say that the first 10, before I started to connect to my Swedish story. So my daughter was born when I was 31. And that's when, in the book, I say, I kind of look at her and I think, oh, I could take all my traumas and gift wrap them and hand them to her as her legacy, or I could really start doing the hard work. And I decided, so the 10 years that I was writing before that, I think I was kind of writing and not really understanding what I was writing about. There was a kind of a disconnect with some of those pieces. The second decade of composing, I was deep into therapy. I was deep into taking care of my daughter. I was a single parent at that point. I had really built a pretty good career in music. I was composing full time, so I made my living off of composing. And those works, I think, are very reflective of where I was in relationship to understanding myself emotionally and some of the traumas I had been. By the time I get to my 40s, I think that had kind of shifted and settled down. And I suddenly started to really feel very connected to a larger space, if you were. And my music started really looking into how am I connected to the world, for a lack of a better word, spiritually. Things that are, above me or beyond me, and I'm writing suddenly titles. I have a string sextet called A Bright Flash of Wings. And that's, the idea for that is, sometimes you're walking outside and suddenly something catches your eye. It's up in the sky and you look up and it's not even important what you're seeing up there. It's that you suddenly look up. You suddenly are connected to a bigger sense of the world. Then I wrote a piece called It Is My Heart Singing, another piece called Delight of Angels. So my interest started to shift to a broader screen, and I think that I've sort of stayed in that for about 20 years. I think my interest is coming back down a little bit to what's happening on a local level. So I have a piece that I wrote during COVID, which is called Leap, which is about, suddenly we've leapt to a place that we just have no clue where it is. I have a piece called Hum, which is about when I was a child, people hummed so much, you would walk outside and they were whistling and humming, and it's this sort of intimate expression, self-expression of music. And then another piece called Hush, which is about that sense of hushing your child. I don't know if I've answered your question quite.
Yeah. Well, and it begets a follow-up, which is, so like during the 20s then, do you feel like, or maybe during your 30s, was there ever a point where the writing and the playing was cathartic for you? Like, was it a release and therapeutic in that way, or did it just take to the point of having Cassie and life kind of changing in some different ways for you vis-a-vis your composing?
It's very hard for me to know when I look back. I was so intense about writing music. It's almost like a person I don't know anymore. I was just this laser focused about music. And I was kind of surprised when I went back and read my journals that I had this kind of, I don't want to say rigidity, but it was so focused. And now where I am in my life, that creativity is, I don't know, it just seems to be, I don't know, it's no longer one thing, it's many
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
It's more of a holistic life thing where, so it's hard for me to tell. I'm sure it was cathartic.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know if I would have been able to articulate that
Of
or
course.
understand that at
At
that
that time,
point.
sure. Well, it seems like, where you are today and through the course of the book that, we haven't gotten to really talking about this yet, but like, forgiveness and understanding. And, it seems like maybe those aspects in combination, like where you write, that Cassie was your great opportunity to not have her inherit the negativity kinds of things, but here's an opportunity to, kind of for you to write a different course, not rewrite, but, to be able to take this in a different kind of way, I feel, has, I don't know what, it's like having gone through that as a process and then going through a therapeutic spiritual healing process and then kind of being if I can put words in your mouth, like being at peace with it, with having the grace of forgiveness, and then now being able to focus on other kinds of things because those things have been dealt with. Is that kind of the case? I mean, I know some things are never kind of always finished with a bow on top, but
Right.
is that kind of
Right.
where
And
your growth has been since those times?
well, certainly in this last 10 years, they've just been amazing, peaceful 10 years. I do think that as this book ends, what I didn't know at that point, so it's really the end of my 40s going into my 50s,
Mm-hmm.
um, was how to set really good boundaries.
Hmm.
And I did suffer a great deal in the next 15 years learning how to set boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And not be the kind of person who wants to fix things or
Yeah.
be uh, the wonderful person that does everything.
Yeah.
I do have a huge amount of energy, but it wasn't necessarily well placed
Yeah.
at that point. And I really have to make myself accountable for that.
Yeah.
Um, so since the end of my second marriage, I just can't even tell you, I just wake up every morning smiling. I just am in such a good place.
Nice.
But it comes with setting some very firm boundaries.
Sure.
I always tell my daughter and my three stepchildren, my beloved three stepchildren, that that I have this imaginary electric fence going around my property, and it's a drama fence, and so anybody who's coming with drama,
Leave it at the gate.
well, they go like, oh, I'm trying to get in, but I can't get in. What's going on? I am all ears for personal trials and tribulations, and but drama and being at a place where I finally have some maturity in not giving advice, just listening. That's a hard one.
Yeah.
Being available in that sense, not jumping up and allowing my anxiety to be amplified by their anxiety and then getting reactive.
Yeah.
That takes a lot of discipline, but the rewards are kind of amazing.
I need to know where you get that fence, Tina. I'd like to, is it on Amazon? I'd like to order one.
Yeah. They always laugh. They go, oh.
Yeah.
And every once in a while, I'll stop one of them. They'll say, well, this thing happened to me, and they were really wrong. I said, is that drama?
Wait a minute.
Wait a minute.
I want to, you made mention of like how, or not necessarily how, but like when the book ends. I want to circle back to that. But before, since we're kind of what we're talking about right now, how is it like, you've talked about all the activities and capabilities and capacities that your mother had, and PhD from Penn, et cetera, travel, kids, et cetera. What was it like for you, in a sense, I don't know, finding your voice probably isn't the right way to say it, but in the work that you did as becoming a composer, getting to the point of being able to, do that as a, full-time career, at some point, also, being a teacher, professor, and being a single mom. Can you maybe talk about what that was like for you during those days, and how you went about, what was successful for you to be able to get through those times as a single parent and balancing motherhood, creativity, keeping afloat, that type of thing?
Sometimes I think being a working mother, is just like dashing from one,
Mm-hmm.
one disaster to another. And the disasters can be really simple, like it's a snow day,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
or the babysitter didn't arrive,
Yeah.
or they had early dismissal, but you didn't know.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that kind of, I don't know, I think it makes parenting kind of anxious or tight, or it's not a very relaxed state
Mm-hmm.
when you, and that's, I mean, truly a parent is at, for me, is I was always at my best when I was relaxed.
Mm-hmm.
And relaxed meant that I had done a certain amount of work that day that had fed me, and I was able to put it aside and be one-on-one with my daughter. And
Mm-hmm.
if for some reason, the babysitter hadn't come through, or, she was homesick all day, I would have a kind of anxiety that was, I think, difficult for my daughter, and a
Mm-hmm.
preoccupate. I was preoccupied
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the time, and I know she felt that. I think kids do
Sure.
feel that,
Oh yeah.
perhaps anyway.
Yeah.
My parents not really present,
Yeah.
and that's part of life as a kid.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. It's the
but I
cliche
think
of quality time, I think.
yes,
That's kind of what
yes,
people started calling it. So,
yes.
yeah.
Um, and I always felt that I was such a much better parent if I had gotten 4 hours of work done during the day, or
Yeah.
I've been lucky to have,
Yeah.
and and but I know she felt that, and I think I it was such composing was such an intense experience for me. It was hard for me to balance that, and I've had to do some repair work with my daughter, and some honesty. She'd say, this was really hard for me, and I'd say, yes, that
Mm-hmm.
must have been really hard, and I can't change that,
Right.
but I can tell you that I'm working on that every day,
Yeah.
so that I don't continue doing that. And that has been very helpful for her.
Good.
Uh,
Well, and I mean, I would also speculate that there were also times that were just the opposite of that, that there were those, plenty of times of shared times together, good memories together, shared moments that, will
yes,
stay with her forever. But, it's like we said it
right.
earlier on, it's easy sometimes to focus on the highlight reel of the foibles as opposed to, all the home runs, so to speak. So,
Well, I think absolutely. We always played together. I've always been a type of parent that really wanted to get down on the floor and play with my
mm-hmm,
kids, whether
mm-hmm.
they're my stepkids or I've always loved that.
Yeah.
We, speaking of Barbie,
Yeah.
my mother would not allow me to have a Barbie because she
Oh.
was a feminist.
Uh-huh.
Um, I, I did get a Barbie gifted to me from my aunt, and she had a disaster. I would always prop her uh, by my nightlight while I was reading before I went to bed. And one day her head touched the bulb, and
Oh.
ooh, yes.
Oh.
But as a feminist, I always wanted my daughter to have the full range of experience, and so
Mhm.
we made lots of Barbie clothes.
Ah.
We built doll houses all the time. We always built furniture, and we played
Oh.
games at night. We did a lot of work, and in fact, just the other day, she was telling me how much she loved her 13th birthday. Where her father is Jewish, so I gave her a Protestant bat mitzvah,
Ah.
which was 13 days out in Utah.
Uh-huh.
Um, and every day I gave her a small gift. It had to be something really personal. So
Uh-huh.
I asked her father to write her a letter. So that was one of her gifts.
Oh.
My mother, who was at that point a Bible scholar, wrote her about her Torah portion, and which was Jacob wrestling with the angel.
Wow.
And so that was one of her gifts. A
Oh.
beautiful fountain pen was one of her gifts. I had copied all the poetry that I love into a little book. So it had to be small.
Wow. Oh, I
And
love that. Oh.
We went out and we did a lot of backpacking and we did a dude ranch. And she was just telling me
Oh.
what a celebration that was for her and how important it was to her. So,
Oh.
I was present,
Yeah.
uh, but I was also absent.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that is the paradox of sometimes not even just single parents. My folks divorced before I was one, and that was kind of just this constant struggle that I know, my mother felt, and there's good days and bad days for the both of us and the both of us together. So, I think and my wife and I have been married almost 38 years. We have two adult children, and we had good days and bad days as well too. And work got in the way some days, and other days it was down on the floor, playing with Legos or whatever. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's the journey of parenting, that there's no perfect way to do it, and you just try and do a percentage of better than bad. So all right, well I have to get out of the sappy stuff here for a second, Tina. I gotta nerd out again back with book design. So like I said earlier on, I really like the approach of the dated journal excerpts. I mean, that really kind of. I mean, I'm also kind of quite into film, and I also, I could just sort of see, if your memoir was made into a major motion picture, I could kind of see, there'd be like the book, this opening up or this going across the screen or whatever, and it was really helpful. I felt like I was like an insider. And I almost felt a little guilty that I'm reading your journal because I'm reading all these other things that are going on or whatever. But now, I shouldn't have found this, but I can't help myself. I got to read that. And it's really okay with Tina because she shared it with me.
Mhm.
Um, I liked also, like, with the coda, and what remains behind. Again, I think just speaks to your inner poet that gets shared externally with your audience, which is lovely. And thank you for that. And it was so sweet to see the photos, throughout. There's that one little black and white square picture of you early on, with like the little teeny, pigtails or whatever. I thought it was so sweet. And then at the end, like you're reading about these people, and I was thumbing back and forth all the time. Here's the brother, and oh, here's what he looks like, or here's whoever and whatever, was just also just really kind of brought. The words to life, and I mean the words were already brought to life just by your eloquence, but the being able to have a literal picture of who I'm reading about, and understanding those. So
Mhm.
I thought that was great. And then you have like at the like kind of very end pieces of the book, you have page references of music by you, and then you have a QR code that I did that takes a reader straight to Spotify, and then you can listen to it. And I just thought that was genius. Here I'm reading about a composer, and I'm reading about her works, and then boom, just grab my phone, and then I can actually, I obviously I could have done that anyway, but just the step saving aspect of that and the immediacy of being able to do it while still phone in one hand and book in the other, I thought was just genius. So were those things that you collaborated with editors with? Was that just organic in terms of your ability to tell stories and apply technology in a, using your creative juices, or how in the world did you do that? Because I want to do stuff like that in the future.
Well, I had always wanted to include my music, and that was, I had no idea about QR codes, and certainly the publisher is probably in her mid 30s, and the editor is in her 40s, and they're very smart, savvy. They really know their field, and I just kept on saying, Sima, you're the experts. You have to lead me, and I have to say, as composers don't collaborate. You know,
Hmm. Hmm.
composers write music and they feel that it's the word of God, and they put it in front of and the performer is trying to get it right. And I wrote an opera and was really introduced to music theater or opera the way the theater is, where it's all a collaborative process.
Mm.
You work with the director, you work with the music director.
Hmm.
If you're fortunate, they're not trying to shape your work, they're trying to understand your work,
Uh-huh.
and as they help you shape it. Um, that is when you're very fortunate to have a good collaboration. It is
Hmm.
about the both of you trying to understand the work and make it alive in the best way that that work can be. And that's what I had with the publisher and the editor. They
Wow.
were always, and because I've had collaborations before, and I don't believe in the kind of the old-fashioned music idea where, the performer looks at the score and thinks they have to do everything exactly the way it is. What is a composer's intention? For me, as I write music, I almost collaborate with the music to create it. Sometimes it has its mind of its own.
I like
Sometimes
that.
I can say, hey, guys, come back here, or that's just not working. And then sometimes, for years, I would write a piece of music and then write a little coda at the end. I'd have this sort of glorious end to the music, but have this little sad coda at the end. And I'm thinking, oh, it's almost like a take back. Like, this is the way I want life to be. Yeah, that's not possible. And I would have fights with it. I'd say, I don't want this. And somehow it just felt like that was the right proportion. I think as an artist, you're always in the work and then you're outside of the work to look at the balance of how do things, what's the architecture of the piece? What's the balance? How does the beginning balance? And certainly when you're writing opera, if you're going to insert a song someplace in the beginning, you have to look to see how that balances out the energy flow for the entire piece.
Wow.
And so I forgot what I was talking about.
Well,
So anyway, working, I've always felt that I collaborate with the music. And then when the performers do it, I feel like they're collaborating with me in creating the piece. Sometimes they say, that's really hard to do, or ultimately at the end of a rehearsal period, they're sort of struggling with all the notes. And I said, you know what? I want you to forget the notes. Who cares about the notes? I want you to feel the piece. I want you to create this piece. This is your piece now. This doesn't belong to me. And so I give them permission to live in the music and fill it out.
Nice.
And then I think when they perform it, it's kind of a collaboration with the audience because it doesn't really exist if people aren't listening to it.
Right. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Again, your poetry comes through. So I go ahead. I don't want to cut you off.
So I just want to say that that's the way I approached my editor and my publisher.
Got it. Well,
That
you're fortunate to have edited such good ones. So that's not always the case as well for writers. So
they're just, yes, that's true. I'm very fortunate. Although I think if I had bad ones, I would have been in a position to say, I'll just self-publish this. So, sometimes you have to make that choice.
Yeah, for sure. So we mentioned earlier too that I wanted to circle back to this. We talked about like the book ends like roughly 20-ish years ago. Is that right? And why is that?
Because
You got part two's coming out, the sequel.
maybe.
Good.
I was at a point where I was sort of tired of living in Philadelphia in looking back at it, and I was entering a new phase. I had met a very wonderful artist and designer and had moved to the Lancaster area to help him raise his three little kids. And that was sort of like another stage of my life. And at that point, that's sort of its own story if I decide to tell it.
Okay.
And I think what's interesting, as much as I was healed, it's sort of the end of my 40s. I also had some vulnerabilities that were, it's sort of like, how you have an issue with something and then you solve that issue. And then what do they say? It just changes clothes and gets back in line.
Yeah, or whack-a-mole, a robust game. Yeah.
Yeah, so I had many more lessons to learn. And it was quite a full series of lessons, and I just felt that it was too complicated to write about.
Gotcha. Well, at least at that point in time. So I'm
Yes.
going to leave that door open. So,
Yeah. I
so
may write about it, and hopefully with the same kind of discretion,
yeah, I'm
and
sure.
love of my just wonderful stepkids.
Yeah, I'm.
Yeah.
I don't think you have any other ability to write other than in that way. So, I know we're pushing on to an hour. I have just a couple more questions if you're good for time.
Certainly.
Okay,
Yes.
awesome, good. So what do you enjoy listening to? Who do you have a primary influence vis-a-vis your work and inspiration? Do you some like what do you listen to when you just want to, kick back and enjoy, putting the headphones on and getting lost in something?
Wow. First of all, oddly enough, I don't like to listen to music very much.
Oh, I
um,
I am surprised.
um, I love going to concerts, however.
Okay.
I love, I was just at a concert, a local concert. I think it was the American String Quartet. It just, there's nothing like being right with the musicians as they're playing.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
that is really wonderful.
Yeah.
I am always interested in what composers are doing now. I music. I love. I had been going to New York City. I have a sister who lives there, and listening to a lot of music, going to a lot of concerts. Um, I happen to love Bach. I
Hmm.
happen to love Monteverdi. I love. Oh boy, I love countertenors. I love just being sitting as close as I can, just being with the sound.
Uh-huh.
Um, but I also love theater and dance. I love always wanted to be a ballerina,
Oh.
was and always loved modern dance. So I listen, go to see a lot of dance. I love dance, and it's always it's kind of an immersion that it's it feeds
Hmm.
my music in some way. But I guess my best sounds are sitting outside. I love ambient sounds.
Ah.
I even love traffic sounds.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I would say that my ears are always open and I'm always listening.
That's nice.
Um, but I don't tend to listen to a lot of music.
Gotcha. Do you know? I'm sure you know of Brian Eno, then, right? And
Mhm,
yeah, it's
mhm,
music for airports, and he's very
mhm.
much into ambient. And I was sort of, in a very distant way, reminded of. I've got his memoir from, gosh, 20ish years ago. I forget the first part, but like something with swollen appendices, and it's kind of a strange little book. It's
Mhm.
I don't have you seen it or have you read it or
No, but I will definitely
yeah,
look it
it's
up.
really kind of a cute little read because honestly, it's like if you were to look at the book, like it's probably 2 inches thick and it's maybe 5 inches tall, like 5 by 5, like a little block.
Mhm.
And he kind of talks about his life in maybe physically, like the first quarter of the book, and then hence the subtitle. Like a year in the life or something like that with swollen appendices, I think is the full title, or pretty darn close to it. I'll get it right in the show notes. And the rest of it is like the appendices, and that's kind of his journal and diarying and talking about going to the studio. And I think his son went with him at one point, and it was a very interesting way that he structured his work to be able to kind of do what you did. With you insinuated things kind of throughout the book, and it had a wonderful flow to it. And he kind of like talked about his like what his year was like, and then kind of unpacked it. He talked about it in a little bit in the front end, and then unpacked it with great detail, for the final 3 quarters of the book. So it was an interesting way to do that. But just when you're talking about, sounds and how that influences you, and the how you get pleasure and enjoyment from that, it just triggered that thought too. So yeah,
Oh,
yeah, I think you would like it. It's a fun little read and cute design. So.
I'll
So
definitely look that up.
so I believe you have a new CD to be released with the Jasper Quartet, and you've got piano and string
Yes.
music coming out, and you've got a choral
Yes.
performance. So tell us all about all those things. My gosh,
Oh
Tina,
my goodness.
golly.
So I have a very large piece called Hymn of the Universe. Um, and I'm really having a digital release of that. And that is based on the writings of Pierre de Teilhard de Chardin, who was in the 50s. He was Catholic priest, and he was almost excommunicated because he believed in Darwinism. So he loved this idea of sort of transforming closer to God. So that idea of Darwin, and his writings I had read. Actually, a friend of mine who's a nun said you should read his books. So I read them. I read them
Wow.
all, and part of his is there's the Hymn to the Universe. His writing is just extraordinary and amazing. So that is going to be a digital release.
Wonderful.
It's about 35 minutes of music.
Wow.
Yeah, and then I have a recording with a group out in Chicago, and they are doing a piece for cello and piano. I don't know when they will release that. And then in the fall, we go into the studios with the Jasper Quartet and Natalie Zhu, who's a wonderful pianist. And we will record a lot of my music that I've written in the last 10 years. Oh. I have a piece called Barefoot, which is about, it was winter and I was just thinking, oh, I want to go out and be barefoot. And then I thought of this whole idea about, the burning bush and how he has to take off his shoes to be in the presence of God.
Oh my gosh.
And I love that idea of sort of taking off your shoes, sort of bearing your soul in a way.
Oh my
SOLE. So that piece is Barefoot. And then I have quite a few other pieces. I have a piece called Weepan, which is weeping in Old English. And it's really about the end of my second marriage. So I'm very excited about that project. It's a little scary, to go into the studio and it's very time consuming and you can get really kind of gnarly and wanting everything perfect. So I'm hoping I won't go there too far. So I'm very excited about those actually 3 recording projects.
Well, I'm excited to hear about them as well too. They sound wonderful. So if listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, get a copy of the book, your memoir, access your music, are there lists that they can know when these other projects are coming out? What are some of the best ways to do so?
Well, if you know my name, Tina Davidson, it's super easy. So my website is tinadavidson.com. You can go on Amazon to buy my book, Spotify. Easy peasy, just type in my name. Any of your digital platforms, you can listen to the recordings of music that is out there. And I think you can also go on SoundCloud. I don't know exactly, but if you go on SoundCloud and just type in my name, you'll see some works there that haven't been recorded.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, so you can sort of snoop around on that.
Behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Facebook, Tina Davidson. I think it's author and composer, or composer and author is my official page. And then also on Instagram. I don't do Twitter. I'm just, I am embracing social media. But I'm doing it in limited quantities.
Sure. Well, you spend your time in much more productive and healthful kinds of ways, as we've discussed. So, and I'll put, for people listening to this in their car or whatever, I'll put all this into the show notes so people can link them in and check them out. So, and you will also be on SoundCloud, because our show is also carried on SoundCloud. So you'll be a public one and you'll be the behind the scenes one as well too. So that's very cool. So, Tina, I just have to say, I really appreciate being able to barge into your life and your time and your brain and to talk about these kinds of things. It's been a joy to get to know you better, and I've really just enjoyed our time together with this conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Living a Life in Full is a production of Stout Media, a subsidiary of Gordian Knot, LLC. Assistant producer, Gracie Wong. Music, Dan O'Brien. Executive producer and host, Dr. Chris Stout. To learn more, stop by our website, A Life in Full, for show notes. And please recommend us to your friends and subscribe on your favorite platform. And as for the obligatory disclaimer, this podcast is for general information uses only and does not constitute the practice of psychology, medicine, nutrition, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical or psychological advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, I take conflicts of interest seriously. For all of my disclosures as well as show notes, please see livingalifeinfull.org/podcast and my LinkedIn profile. Thanks, and until next time.